Greetings. Welcome to the program. Actually, that's my opening line for my show on Hope Channel called Cliff, and I'm not actually taping the show right now, but I am in front of the cameras where I've been taping my show for many, many years. In fact, I don't really even remember how many years I had been doing my show Cliff. What I do remember is a number of years ago, I was at a camp meeting in, I think it was Canada, I think maybe British Columbia, and one of the people who ran the Hope Channel came up to me, heard me speak, and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing a TV show for us, or at least giving it a try?" So we got the studios right here at the GC, and I came downstairs. They slapped a little makeup on this mug, which back then didn't need half as much as it needs now. But anyway, we taped a few shows, and we went and we did it for numerous years. There was a little break for a couple of years, but we're back taping the show Cliff. And I'm the host of Cliff, and I've had a lot of fun over the years dealing with all sorts of topics. In fact, when they first came to me for the show, I said, look, I don't want to get up here and preach on the mark of the beast. It's not because I don't believe it, but it's like you've got Sean Boonstra, you've got Mark Finley, you've got Doug Batchelor, you've got John Brown, you've got all these people who can do that 10 times better than me. But I thought, I was raised in the secular world, educated in secular schools, and kind of liked philosophy and literature and so on. And I thought, well, why don't I take some of this stuff that I've read and I've learned about and use it as outreach to try to reach people, taking a different approach, not the direct approach that we would do in a revelation seminar or an evangelistic series. In other words, I wanted to get into philosophy, get into history, but at the same time, I wasn't just going to get up there and wax eloquent about Socrates or about, the great myth or whatever, or Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, whatever. In other words, any of the philosophical things or historical things I did or would do, it was always with the goal of at some point trying to reach people and bring them to some aspect of truth. And in other words, I wasn't going to sit there and give them the whole three angels message in one talk. Number of talks I would deal with would just be the logic and reason to even believe in God. And you get done with it, and I was hoping that somebody might have thought, wow, I never thought about that before. That's a good argument for the existence of God. Or do another program on, that's a good thought. If there really isn't some kind of transcendent being, or if there isn't, then where do we get morality from? Where can morality possibly come from? In other words, I would get into all this stuff, but ultimately, my goal in the end was always to try to, and I wasn't preaching to the choir. I mean, sometimes I would have distinctly Adventist things, but a lot of times my programs were not geared to the saints in the pews. My program was geared to the pagans out in the street and to the heathen and people who, for whatever God's providence could get them to turn on and say, who's this crazy guy on here? And hopeful, saying something, drawing them along in a chain of logic to help them reach a point where they'd say, wow. Because, I even think back of my conversion, my becoming a believer, and there were a series of small steps along the way, bits of things along the way. I still remember one moment, I was just maybe 21 years old, when it hit me that truth had to exist. And I think I've done some shows on that, on the idea that, hey, truth has to exist. I mean, how are you going to lead someone to the three angels message and to Jesus and salvation if they're not even convinced there's any truth out there and so forth? So I always things like that. I would try at times just to do shows to take them along step by step, or even just to give them one step that might not bear fruit for years, but could somehow be something God could use in reaching a soul. And that has been my goal with the program Cliff, and I did some taping a few months ago, and I've been slacking off, but I'm getting ready to start again when I get home, just to get up in the morning and start working on ideas for more shows, dealing with questions of good and evil, right and wrong, the existence of God, salvation. Some programs are very in your face, and others are generally, I tend to be more roundabout, just because, again, I want to talk about things that I think people out in the world might be interested in, and then yet at the same time, then take that and use that to pull them in and to, as I said, just open their mind up and, again, help give a step, help answer a question that, if answered, could then lead them to another step, to something that ultimately, when the time comes, when the Holy Spirit confronts them and they have to make a decision for Jesus, that we will have, through the grace of God and through whatever little humble efforts I can pull off on this show, maybe have been able to play a role in helping get them to come to the knowledge of Jesus. So everything I do on my show, ultimately, on all my programs, is geared towards that. Well, with that, I'd like to, since we're having an Adventist audience here today and this camp meeting, I'd like to give a little message or something, my favorite thing, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what is the gospel? What has Jesus done for us, and the great plan of salvation? And a while back, I had done some reading in the Gospels. And there's a famous story in the Gospels that we all know about it. And I like to take another little look at it. And it's the thief on the cross. And the story of the thief on the cross. Because I really believe we can get a very powerful gospel message from the story of the thief on the cross. Well, anyway, we all know the background with the thief on the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, 3.5-year ministry, antagonized the leaders long enough. Jesus was arrested, betrayed, mocked, beaten, tortured, and sentenced to death, sentenced to the cross. And yet, however terrible all this stuff was, it's amazing how Jesus said over and over, these things had to happen in order that the scriptures be fulfilled. Jesus was always going back to the scriptures. The New Testament writers always going back to the scriptures, the Word of God. That has to be our foundation. I don't have a moment for any of this higher critical, historical critical stuff that challenges even one verse in the Bible. We don't understand everything in the Bible. We don't understand what it all means or whatever, but there's nothing. This idea, well, we can't trust this text, or this text was more important than this, or so on. Garbage. All Scripture is inspired by God. And the greatest example we have of how to use Scripture is Jesus himself, who never entertained a doubt about the truthfulness or veracity of the Word of God. Don't go down that path, because it's going to lead you straight to the second death. Anyway, let's pick up the story. The thief on the cross. Jesus is crucified. Starting Luke 23, verses 32. 2 other men, both criminals, were led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they were crucified with him, along with the criminals, one on the right, one on the left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood by watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." This is where it was written above him, which read, "This is the King of the Jews." Okay, this is the immediate background. Jesus is on the cross, and as he's placed on it, he's being mocked. He's being mocked by the Romans, and he's being mocked by the religious leaders. And it's in this context that we meet the two thieves, okay? But now they appear again. Luke 23:39. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. And he said, "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Now, we don't know a whole lot about these men, other than that they were criminals. Mark says they were robbers. What did they steal? Well, the texts don't say per se. But, here's the thing about the Romans. Yeah, we know the Romans were mean and the Romans were harsh and all. That's all true. But, the Romans were sticklers for law. And in other words, they were not going to put these men on the cross for petty thievery. Okay? I don't think these guys were stealing loaves of bread to feed their hungry children. If you know any of the writings of Victor Hugo in Les Miserables, these guys, none of them were Jean Valjean, okay? These guys were deemed bad enough that the Romans, who didn't want to crucify Jesus, nevertheless hung these men on the cross anyway. So anyway, here they are, the three of them, dying on the cross. And one of them starts to mock Jesus. Again, he said, "If you are the Christ, save us, save yourself and us." Now, it's very interesting. This thief who's mocking Jesus is really just repeating the words of the religious leaders. I guess the thief must have been Jewish, okay? So he's mocking Jesus. "If you are the Christ, HaMashiach, the Messiah," okay? He's mocking him because that's a Jewish concept. It's a Jewish thing. But when the Romans mock him, the soldiers, they don't know anything about this Messiah silliness. That's Jewish superstition. The Romans mock him as the King of the Jews, okay? A political figure, because that's what the Romans care about. They don't care about this Messiah stuff. Okay, so anyway, here's Jesus. He's getting mocked as the Messiah, and he's getting mocked as the King of the Jews. Talk about having to eat your words one day, folks. But anyway, okay. So the one thief starts mocking Jesus. What happens next? But Luke 23, verses 40 and 41. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due rewards of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Wow, nothing wrong? Now, this is very interesting, and don't miss this point. According to Matthew and Mark, at first, both thieves cursed him. Matthew 27:44 reads, "Even the robbers who were crucified with him reviled him with the same thing." Okay, Mark 15:32 reads, "Even those who were crucified with him reviled him." So, in other words, Matthew and Mark have both the thieves mocking him. Okay, Luke, it's not contradictory. Luke, which we're reading from, just ignores the first time the thief mocked him. Okay, Luke is just focusing on the second thief, and he didn't talk about that. But the bottom line is, at the beginning, this thief mocked Jesus as well. Okay, so at first, both are cursing and mocking Jesus. But apparently this one has a change of mind. Something happens. Two thieves, two criminals sentenced to death, but they're starting to have two different attitudes. Okay, for starters, this second thief confessed. He said we belong there. He admitted his guilt. There was no attempt to cover it up or to blame others, blah, blah, blah. I wasn't treated nice as a kid. I guess I don't want to make fun of that. Some people have had terrible backgrounds. But the point is, he said, look, we deserve to be here. And not only that, he knows that that first thief, his partner in crime or whatever, was wrong to mock Jesus. He rebuked him, saying, don't you fear God, man? It's like, why are you doing this to this innocent man? He must have known something about Jesus. He must have known something, because he said, this man has done nothing wrong. And it's very interesting. In the desire of ages, listen to what the spirit of prophecy tells us about this second thief. Don't miss this point. She said that he had, quote, he had seen and heard Jesus and had been convicted by his teachings, but had been turned away from him by the priests and the rulers. Now get this, listen to this. Seeking to stifle conviction. Folks, that's bad, okay? Seeking to stifle conviction, he had plunged deeper and deeper into sin until he was arrested, tried as a criminal, and condemned to die on the cross. Now, plunged into stifled conviction by plunging into sin. And folks, the sin was something greater than coveting his neighbor's donkey or not keeping the Sabbath. The sin was deemed criminal enough for the Romans to want to crucify this guy. So the point is, we're not talking about angels here. This guy's no angel. He was somebody convicted of Jesus. And then it's one thing had it said, well, though he didn't know about Jesus. He was blind to Jesus, completely ignorant. But that's not what she says. He had been convicted, and he stifled the conviction by plunging into sin. Sin bad enough to get him crucified by the Romans. Okay. Anyway, this guy has seen Jesus before. And now he sees Jesus again in this context. And he was right there. He must have heard Jesus say, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And he heard the religious leaders mock him as a Messiah. He heard the Romans mock him as the King of the Jews. Okay, it's amazing. Somehow, amid all of this, amid all that's going on, the noise and the pain and his own suffering, this thief starts putting things together. And at this point, and I get goosebumps even thinking about this. I really do. But anyway, at this point, except for outside of Jesus on the cross, who knows who he is and who knows what's happening, this criminal, this thief, I believe is the only other human being in the world who understands what's going on. The disciples, they're useless at this point. They're busy running with their tail between their legs. This guy, outside of Jesus, is the only human being who knows what is going on. And that's why he says to Jesus, He says to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He knew what was going on. He understood it. Here it is, a criminal, a thief, dying amid all the rancor, the violence, the shouting, the mocking. He, the only human being in the world outside of Jesus, understands what's going on. And then he utters his helpless cry, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And what does Jesus say to this guy? What does Jesus say to this sinner, this criminal? What does he say to him? Well, friend, I'd really like to help you, but thou shalt not steal. Did he say that? Did he say, well, friend, I'd really want to do something for you, but, stifling conviction by plunging into sin, that's pretty bad. Did he say, I really would like to do something, but you shouldn't let the religious leaders lead you astray? Did you shouldn't have, did he say, I'd really like to help you, but hey, bud, don't forget 30 minutes ago you were cursing me and reviling me. Did Jesus throw anything of this man's past up in his face? Did Jesus quote him the 10 Commandments? Did he quote him from Psalms about victory over sin? Did Jesus preach to him from his own sermons? When he said, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Did Jesus look ahead to Paul and quote Paul, who said, follow holiness without which no man will see God? Or did Jesus even look further ahead and find some Ellen White quote he could take and beat this guy over the head with about saying they're not worthy of the kingdom? Did Jesus do any of that? In my Bible, Jesus looks at this man, a man who has absolutely nothing to offer, a man who seems like his only relationship to the law was to violate the law. He looks at this man and basically, without any fine print, without any caveat, without any but-ums, he looks at this man who has absolutely nothing to offer. And he says, and he looks and says, look, I'm telling you right now, I'm telling you now, at this moment, despite your faults, despite your character, despite what you've done, I'm telling you right now, you will be with me in paradise. Right? I mean, am I missing something here? Is Goldstein, if Goldstein's given us cheap grace, well, friends, if Goldstein's given you cheap grace, then Jesus gave the thief on the cross cheap grace. And you might want to accuse me of doing it, but you sure ain't going to accuse Jesus of doing it, right? What am I missing here? Well, folks, I don't think I'm missing anything. I think I'm giving you an irrefutable, powerful, real-time presentation of the basic truth that we are justified by faith without the deeds of the law. What else? As I said, what relationship did this man have other than to break the law here? Look, folks, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. I've been working at the GC since since I had nice, black, thick hair and no wrinkles, okay? That's what 36 years of life will do to you. Anyway, the point is, I believe in the law. I believe in the 10 Commandments. I believe in obeying the 10 Commandments. I believe God gives us power to obey the 10 Commandments. But all I know is one thing. My keeping the law and my attempt to keep the law, it's not going to get me into heaven. If I'm relying on the law to get me into heaven and my law keeping to get me into heaven, here's the bottom line, folks. Jesus has changed my life. If you knew what I was like, well, you don't want to know. and you knew what I was like before and what I'm like now, you would say, man, the power of God in this guy's life is astonishing. Jesus has changed my life in every way. But if there's one thing that my years as a believer has taught me, if my experience as a believer has taught me, is that if I'm not saved, okay, if I'm not saved by the exact same thing that saved the thief on the cross, if I'm not saved by the exact same thing, because I'm no more worthy than the thief, if I'm not saved by that, then there's not a doubt in my mind. You can stand on that wall at the end of the millennium and you can wave down poor Cliff down there, because if I don't have what Jesus has done for me, like as he did for the thief on the cross, I ain't going to be there. I'm not going to be there. Okay, now others, you can say, I'm going to grit my teeth and I'm going to fine. And you can do it by that. You can do it by getting holy enough to earn your way there. Well, then you're a better person than I am. Okay, again, Jesus has changed my life, promises me victory, believe in victory. But let me ask any of you right here who are listening. I'm assuming you're Adventists. So you believe in keeping the law? Our very name, Seventh-day Adventists. We believe in the law. We keep the one commandment that the vast majority of the Christian world tramples on. So, you keep the law. Do you keep the law good enough? Is your record of law keeping you think good enough for you to get into heaven? Well, if you don't think so, folks, then what do you think's going to get you there? What do you think? What are you relying on to get you there? I know what I'm relying on. I'm relying on the exact same thing that got the thief on the cross there. I am going before as a helpless sinner whose merits as all his righteousness are beged edin. That's the Hebrew translation of it. It's kind of gross. I'm not even going to give you that's the Hebrew. I'm not even going to translate it for you. Get your concordance and read it yourself. All their righteousness, beged edin. Okay? So I'm leaning on what Jesus gave the thief on the cross. Now, there are things called alternative histories. I've read a couple books like that. They're what-if things. What if JFK, when he went to Dallas, heeded the authority of heeded what the Secret Service said and said, Mr. President, don't go to Dallas without some protection. They don't particularly like you down there. Okay, say he heeded and he hadn't gotten shot. Or let's say there was this young art student in Vienna, Austria, who failed two times, maybe even 3 times to get into art school. Suppose that young Austrian got into art school and became a professional artist instead of the Reich Chancellor of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945. How different would the world be? Okay, there are these alternative, what had happened had the Romans lost the Second Punic War, which ultimately spread them all over the world. In other words, there are these, what would have happened had things played out different in history? How different would the world be? Well, they're speculative. Nobody knows. So I'm going to try to do a little alternative history here with the story of the thief on the cross. Give me a little, what do they call it? I forgot. I used to be in literature. Poetic license. Okay. Give me a little poetic license. So anyway, Jesus promises this thief, probably the only person in the world at that moment outside of Jesus, who knew what was happening on the cross. And he said, but I'm telling you right now, despite everything, you're going to be with me in paradise. And then somebody runs up to the thief and said, hey, you've been pardoned. you've been pardoned by the Romans. And they take the guy down from the cross. Now, I just recently wrote a book. I want to give myself a plug for one of my books. It's called Risen, Finding Hope in the Empty Tomb. It's a book about the resurrection of Jesus. So run to your ABC or get online, buy it right away. Don't wait. At least wait till Sabbath is over. Anyway, the point is I did a fair amount of reading on the resurrection. And generally, if the few times people do come down from the tomb, if it ever happened, they don't live very long, okay? But let's just say he came down and he lived. Okay? You know what? I think he would not have been a thief anymore. Okay? I think Jesus knew his heart. The man was converted right then and there. I think he would have been a new person in Jesus Christ. And he would have had a whole new life in Jesus. Would he have made mistakes? Would he have been a sinner? Would he need to grow? Of course, like we all do, as we all do. But he would have been a new person in Jesus and would have been a witness to others, to the world, and to the onlooking universe of the grace and power of Jesus. And I read something even this morning where Ellen White said, she said, what was it, that amazing quote that even the angels in heaven, the unfallen angels, are safe only as they look to the cross of Jesus. Wow. Wow. The cross would have changed this man's life the way it's changed mine and the way it's changed millions of others. But in the end, what was going to get that man in heaven? What was going to get him? What he did? No, he already had the assurance of salvation because of the righteousness of Jesus for him, outside of him, in place of him, that Jesus gave to him because the man grasped it by faith. And again, folks, I don't care who we are, how many good works we do through the grace of God in us, how much God changes us. I don't care if we're part of a final generation, which, final generation, so faithful and so holy that, man, if somebody eats one more bean sprout sandwich, that person will float off to heaven even before Jesus gets here. That's fine. I don't have a problem with people believing that. Well, that's a bit exaggerated. You know my point. The point is, I don't care who we are, where we are, what level of growth, whatever. In the end, our hope of salvation, what saves us, what saves this final generation, what saves the saints before Jesus, after Jesus, that is going to be the same thing that saved that thief on the cross right there next to Jesus, is what Jesus had done for us, outside of us, in place of us. The righteousness of God that is ours by faith. Anyway, now, again, folks, when I do my programs, I think I might have done something like this. And every now and then, when I do my shows, I kind of hit this stuff real hard. But ultimately, when I do my program, Cliff, though I don't usually as blatant as this, everything I'm doing with the show is ultimately to try to move people closer and closer to this great truth that I just tried my best to preach to you right here. This hope that we have, because, as a friend of mine, a former pastor of mine, name is Martin Weber. And I remember what Marty Weber once said. And Marty, if you're listening, thank you for this thought. I remember Martin Weber once said, in the end, if it isn't good enough to get you off the planet, it doesn't do you any good. And I love the law. I love God's law. I keep God's law. How I love thy law. I meditate on a day at night. Well, that's what David said. I can't quite say I do that, but I know what God's law is. But in the end, my hope of salvation, I who love God's law, is found in the righteousness of Jesus, the same righteousness that he gave to that unworthy thief on the cross. That's the righteousness I claim for myself as well.